America the Beautiful. We all know this song, but what exactly makes our country so beautiful? I think it's the people. I'm Krista, and I'm a fifth-generation Asian American of Chinese descent. For multi-generational Asian Americans like myself, it can be easy to take our citizenship for granted, to forget, or not even know how hard it was for our Asian ancestors to gain entry into the country where we wake up, live, and breathe every day. If they hadn't fought to survive back then, we wouldn't be able to thrive today. Immigration has seen a rise and fall in distinct waves throughout the centuries. So, which wave brought my parents here, or my great-grandparents? And did the immigration tides ebb or flow in order for our ancestors to arrive? Let's find out together as we travel the tumultuous seas of America's immigration story. Long before my family arrived, the Silk Road was closed to Europeans. So Christopher Columbus and other explorers raced to uncover ways to reach Asia, routes that could be faster, easier, more prosperous. When they reached what is now the continental United States of America, and the sudden competition for power and wealth ushered in its very first wave of settlers, mostly Europeans and indentured soon-to-be African slaves. In the 1760s, the first Asians to settle here were the indentured Filipino Luzon Indians. They were part of the Spanish galleon's crew headed to Acapulco. Many literally jumped ship to escape harsh servitude and fled to the Louisiana marshes, where they established shrimping and fishing communities, like St. Malo. It wasn't until 1776, America's birth year, that the first official wave of U.S. immigrants arrived. Like the early settlers, they were mostly Europeans and Africans. Although we wouldn't see a systemic migration of Asians to the U.S. for yet another half-century, the new nation's first naturalization law already affected them, even before they got here. The Naturalization Act of 1790 barred non-whites and indentured servants from citizenship. A handful of years later, the War of 1812 brought this initial wave of immigration to an end, when transatlantic migration was disrupted by the literal battle at sea. As the 1830s dawned across the country, America would see a huge number of immigrants riding the wave to freedom, escaping war, famine, economic turmoil, persecution. That's where my family's American journey begins, with great-grandpa Tom, who joined this wave fleeing immigrants in 1848. Like him, many were dads, uncles, brothers, male laborers who had to leave their loved ones in hopes of making money with their hardworking hands to send back to their families. They would be the first, but not the last, of many immigrants seeking to replace prejudice with opportunity. In San Francisco, the lure of Gold Mountain called to 4G Tom and 25,000 other Chinese immigrants from southern China. He made his way to Marysville, which was touted as the gateway to the gold fields. Other immigrants headed to Hawaii. Although Hawaii was not yet U.S. territory, it attracted U.S. investors to develop the lucrative sugar and rice industries, which meant they needed a whole lot of manpower, cheap and fast. 195 Chinese immigrants comprised the first foreign contract workers, followed by 900 Japanese immigrants. Eventually, others would arrive from Korea, the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Portugal. There were a few Japanese women who arrived as picture brides in arranged marriages orchestrated by their parents, who would literally point at a photo. But fortunately, now we can swipe right for ourselves. After the war with Mexico, more immigrants streamed in as a substantial landmass encompassing 9 present-day states was ceded to the U.S. Determined to jump on the land, Congress secured these Western territories through settlements and railroads. In 1862, the American Homestead Act was passed to entice settlers. Any adult citizen or intended citizen who had never borne arms against the U.S. government could receive 160 acres of land to farm and improve. This attracted many, like the Polish and Scandinavians. However, this wasn't exactly an Oprah moment with, "You get free land, you get free land." With no path to citizenship, Asians were completely cut out of the equation. The U.S. government did need Asians for another reason, though. They wanted to build the Transcontinental Railroad, which they believed would be the key to strengthening infrastructure and unifying the country. So, the Burlingame-Stewart Treaty was established, which pledged unrestricted immigration to Chinese citizens and granted China most favored nation status. Sounds like a win-win, right? Well, not exactly, as we'll soon see that these same industrialists and politicians celebrating the steady flow of incoming cheap Chinese labor would turn the tides against them. And, ironically, many of these against the Chinese immigrants were immigrants themselves. You know how we hear some Americans complaining about immigrants taking their jobs? Well, that stems all the way back to the 1870s. With the California gold rush over and the Transcontinental Railroad complete, there was an oversupply of cheap labor, leaving the Asians and newly arriving white workers in competition for the same jobs. To make matters more complicated, Americans were experiencing the worst economic depression in national history, a retreat from the Reconstruction Act of 1867, and gearing up for the presidential election. Because California was a swing state and the center of the anti-Asian movement, the presidential candidates had to be anti-Chinese to win. Could things get worse? Only time would tell. And sure enough, over the next 50 years, the rise in violence, war, discrimination, and hostility escalated, giving way to a series of even harsher restrictions on Asian immigration. This was all to keep out less than 1% of the population. The first to be restricted from entering the United States were the individuals labeled as undesirables. The Page Act of 1875 mainly targeted the coolies, or the indentured workers from Asia, and the women imported here for immoral purposes. Mostly Chinese women stereotyped as prostitutes. As a result, Chinese bachelor societies sprang up because their wives and families couldn't enter the United States. There were barely any Asian women, and to top it off, misogynist laws and attitudes prevented them from interracial relationships. It was around this time my paternal great-great-grandpa, Fong Chao, arrived. His timing was impeccable, because in 1880, Chinese immigration was suspended. And in 1882, with the Chinese Exclusion Act, the first law ever to bar people based on race was passed, and it covered almost all potential Chinese immigrants. Fortunately for us, brave souls like Wong Kim Ark, born in the United States, fought back. During this time, he won an important legal battle, gaining birthright citizenship for anyone born on US soil. That would include 3 generations of my ancestors. And now me. Thank you, Wong Kim Ark. Barred from entry, the Chinese now searched for alternate routes to enter the United States, looking to Canada and Mexico. And in 1906, a back door opened unexpectedly when the devastating earthquake in San Francisco destroyed all municipal records. This allowed some Chinese to enter the United States by fraudulently claiming they were either born here, or in the case of paper sons, they had US citizen fathers. With fewer Chinese arriving, Asian Indians, Filipinos, Koreans, and Japanese stepped in to fill the labor gap, especially for agriculture in the West. However, discrimination could not be stopped from rearing its ugly head, as now rising tensions between Japan and the US would restrict immigration of Japanese laborers through the 1907 Gentlemen's Agreement. To enforce restrictions, Angel Island opened in San Francisco in 1910. You could say that Ellis Island in New York functioned to welcome immigrants, while Angel Island functioned to find Asians to exclude. And if processing times were a good indication of prevailing sentiments, elite and European arrivals would be processed in a few hours, but Asians, well, they would be detained for entire weeks or months. By 1917, when it seemed inevitable that the United States was going to get involved in World War I, isolationism and xenophobia would basically bar all Asians with the Immigration Act of 1917 and the Asiatic Barred Zone. For those like my great-great-grandpas and their families who were here and able to stay, they settled in places like Marysville and Vallejo, California, ethnic communities where they worked hard and relied heavily on their networks for support and safety. Amid terrible discrimination, my grandma Alice and her sister Auntie Mix studied hard and eventually became the first Chinese-American public school teacher and the first Chinese-American public health nurse in California. At this point, you must be thinking, what more could possibly happen against Asians? Well, With the Immigration Act of 1924 and its discriminatory ethnic quotas, the tides turned against the Southern and Eastern Europeans, but also prohibited the Asians outright. As President Coolidge remarked, "America must remain American." But how was American defined? Because during World War II, 80,000 US-born Japanese Americans were incarcerated. They were displaced to camps without any due process. Citizens who chose to serve their country, like 6 of my granduncles. And the xenophobia would continue. Now, if you're a history buff like myself, you might say, wait, Krista, what about the Magnuson Act of 1943 and the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1952? Didn't they actually promote Asian immigration and naturalization? Although these laws deceptively made it look like the Chinese and Europeans were finally on equal footing in having a quota, the national origins quota severely restricted the annual number of undesirable immigrants able to enter. A mere 105 for the Chinese, a trickle to plug the wave. The quotas did, however, promote an immigrant population that was homogeneous and white, favoring Northern and Western Europeans in particular. So, after all that struggle, how did 20 million immigrants of Asian descent get here? Did I mention we're a pretty resilient race? Well, we are. By the Statue of Liberty, the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965 was signed. The ethnic quotas were finally removed in favor of a preference system. This worked for some countries like China, but not for others. Canada, and especially Mexico, with historically high levels of immigration, now found themselves with a cap. For those like nations in Africa, they still didn't qualify to enter due to preference criteria. Even so, this act has since dramatically changed the demographic makeup of America's population. For Asians, many more options to immigrate became available than during the exclusion era. The ability to enter the mainstream workforce as students and skilled workers through this wave now allowed Asians to put down roots throughout the country and eventually bring their extended families over. Asian immigration would take off from here. This next wave carried authorized, unauthorized, and young vulnerable immigrants seeking refuge from hardship, war, and persecution to America's land and shores. Since 1975, over 3 million refugees or asylees have arrived in the US. This included 1.25 million Southeast Asians from Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia due to the Vietnam War. Another 500,000 were granted entry from Iran, Cuba, Syria, Afghanistan, and Ukraine. And in 1992, 54,000 Chinese nationals became US permanent residents following the Tiananmen Square incident. Today, considerations have broadened to include the status of women in their home country, domestic violence victims, LGBTQ, and climate refugees. A decade later, 3 million more would call their US home when their status was legalized through a one-time amnesty. The Immigration and Control Act also tried to curtail the inflow of unauthorized immigrants by placing stricter regulations on employers and strengthening border controls. Was it effective though? Today, there are an estimated 11 million undocumented non-citizens in the United States, 15% of whom are Asian. In this period, we see a switch from unskilled labor to welcoming a more diverse, skilled workforce, further punctuated by the Immigration Act of 1990, which introduced the H-1B visa and the diversity visa lottery programs. Arriving at present day with the COVID pandemic of 2020, immigration temporarily flatlined when all US visa services were suspended globally. Since reopening, the US immigration numbers have seen a quick return, but not everyone is staying. With fewer immigration restrictions, circular migration is again an option, with influencing factors that range from equal or better economic opportunities abroad to increased political tensions to immigration policies and practices once again targeted toward the Chinese. Immigration is a constant defining story in and of America. Asian immigrants arrived as early as 200 years ago and as recently as today. They came for many of the same reasons as other immigrants, but their story was one of exclusion and discrimination. A race previously deemed unable to assimilate, essential but foreign. Through resilience over resistance, through contribution and community, Asians now make up 7% of the United States population, a population where 97% of Americans are either immigrants or descendants of immigrants. America is far from perfect, but it continues to be a beacon of hope and possibility for about 1 million migrants each year. Though we all come from different places, each and every one of our immigrant stories matters. Together, we form history, her story and our story. With open minds, we open ourselves to learning from and growing beside each other, to both inspiring and being inspired by what we are humanly capable of overcoming when we seek a better future. It's important that we never forget why our ancestors came, and that we celebrate the brave stories of how they went from rocky waves to planting roots and nourishing family trees. I will continue to learn about my family's American journey. Will you join me and find out yours?